Hi guys, welcome back to our second video on the topic of disability. This time I want to think about terms, terminology, jargon, what words do we use, and I want to give you a really interesting definition of disability. Good. These questions are all much more difficult than you think, and I'm going to illustrate this in the next couple of minutes. Let's start off thinking about terminology. I would argue we have to be careful with language when talking about disability. Why? Think about that. And also this second question, what about talking about disability in a foreign language, a language other than your mother tongue? Why is this difficult? Why must we be careful? Pause here. I'm guessing you've come up with a number of ideas. I think the first point I'd like to stress is the language around disability is constantly changing, constantly. And maybe it's nice if I give you an example from your own language, from your own mother tongue. I studied social work in Germany. I think in the year 2004 was when I started. And I was using a couple of older books, and I found an interesting word in these books, Behinderten. So you wouldn't talk about a disabled person, you'd say Behinderte as one word. This quickly went out of fashion in the early 2000s. By the time I finished my studies in 2007, everybody was saying Menschen mit Behinderung. So it was quite a different formulation, and nobody said Behinderten anymore. And then we had the idea of Handicap, so a kind of German variant of an old English word. Menschen mit Handicap was the new expression to use. And then in the next decade, it must have been something like 2014, 2015, we really started talking about Menschen mit Beeinträchtigung. So my German example illustrates how you might have 4 different expressions being used one after the other over a 20-year period. Quite literally, the language might change every 5 years. Good. My point was also interesting as an illustration here. If you wanted to translate those German expressions into English, you couldn't do it word for word. Okay, the word which a German speaker is using in one particular year will not necessarily be the equivalent of an English or an American expression, or the expression in French or Spanish. So please note, we cannot translate word for word when we're talking about disability. As a translator, your only question is, what's the sensitive, modern, correct terminology here? What language would disabled people like to hear me using? Good, let's move on. Let's have some more basic questions. Next question, what's the opposite of disabled? Doctors sometimes say healthy to describe a child that doesn't have a disability. Is this okay? Some of my students often use the word normal. How do I react when my students use the word normal? So what's the opposite of disabled? Next question. German and French speakers, some Scandinavians, now use the early English word handicapped. Is this word okay in the English language? And my third question, which is really interesting actually, what meaning does the word impairment have? Oh, clue, look at the etymology. Yeah, pause here and discuss with your friend. So what can we say about these questions? Let's go back to the first one. What's the opposite of disabled? Doctors do say healthy. It really isn't the correct word to use. I think the only reason why they say it is because there is a fear around the word disabled. So they say healthy, it's not the right word. My own professor, when I was a student, gave me a nice example of this. A wheelchair user this week has a cold. That wheelchair user is not healthy this week because he or she has a cold. The next week, the cold is gone. The person is better. No more runny nose. So the wheelchair user is now healthy again. Still disabled, but healthy again. Illustrates the point nicely, doesn't it? So be careful. Don't use the word healthy in that way. Normal, to be honest, the word normal here is not just the wrong word, it is actually a deeply offensive word. This word is highly problematic. There is no such idea of an exclusive normal person. Disability is utterly part of a normal human biography. Indeed, many of us may have a period of disability before we die. It's very, very common in old age. So a disability is something like a little bit of the blues, you know, a bit of depression. This is part of the human condition. You can be disabled and you're still totally, utterly normal. So never Use the word normal if you want to talk about somebody who is not disabled. And if you use the word normal in this way in my lessons, you'll get my Paddington Bear stare. And if that doesn't have any effect, you'll notice how my face is starting to turn red and I'm getting stressed. This word is really not okay. Never use it. Ditto for the next term we're discussing. Please note, although the word handicapped, pronounced in various ways, is current jargon in many European languages, it is not in English. It was used when I was a kid, but I was a kid a long, long time ago, guys. You don't want to go back to the 1970s. It's like life on Mars back there. So please note, it was used in the past. It was authentic language. It might still be used in some countries. I don't know, who knows, maybe in India, let's say, it's still a current word, but not in British English, not for sociologists or social workers, for example. Be careful. Impairment, impairment's a lovely word, and I invited you to think about the etymology, Of course, it's got the word pair in it, hasn't it? I'm going to do something which I do in my lessons, guys. Have a look at my sock. The point with video lessons is that you can't really see somebody's socks. It's really hard to do. I don't know if you got that. I'm going to just stand on my chair to show my sock. That's better, isn't it? Can you see those seagulls, guys? So you just saw my left sock, and my left sock had seagulls on it. What do you think is on my right sock? Seagulls too, you're thinking. Damn right. So that's how it works. When we talk about a pair, we mean two things which are the same. In fact, you Germans know that. The German word for a romantic couple, me and my partner, is Paar. Oh, you Germans, you're so lovely. I love that word, isn't that nice? So a pair are two things that are the same and belong together. Impairment is the opposite. An impairment is when something is not the same. Okay, so a disabled person may have an impairment, and it's something in their body which is not the same as that thing in a non-disabled person's body. Does that make sense? So quite simply, this idea of not the same. Hold on to that idea, we'll come back to that word later. More terminology. In our earlier video, the one we watched a moment ago, we considered Alison Lapper's life. She's physically disabled, however, not all disabled people are physically disabled. There's other kinds of disability, of course. What other kinds of disability can you think of? Pause here. Excuse me. So I'm guessing you found a few different types of disability. There's 3 or 4 in total. Typically we make kind of like basic crude categorizations. Physical disability is one important category of disability. Other forms of disability, some people, for example, are blind or deaf, and we call these disabilities sensory disabilities because they're disabilities of the senses. I suppose in theory it's possible to have a disability where you feel differently from other people. It's not so common though. Blindness and deafness, the more common ones there. Other forms of disability, if I have, say, Down syndrome or some forms of autism, we talk about that person in British English as having learning difficulties. It's quite a weird expression actually, and quite hard to translate into German because it sounds wrong, but we really do say that. My American friends would describe the same disabilities, Down syndrome or more severe forms of autism, they would describe them as being intellectual disabilities. So there you are, learning difficulties or intellectual disabilities for that 3rd category. There's a kind of 4th category. I worked in psychiatric social work. I worked in a mental health social work. And in psychiatric social work, in mental health social work, you work with people with mental health problems. For example, severe depression, schizophrenia, and so on. And some of these depressions, these disorders like schizophrenia are quite long-term, and you could argue those things are disabilities. Certainly using legal definitions, they would be. So they are kind of 4th category, but some people may wish to separate that 4th category. To recap, to summarize again, typically we would categorize disability as physical disability, as sensory disability, I've lost my track now. Physical disability, sensory disability, and learning difficulties, which the Americans call intellectual disabilities. Good, let's move on. Here comes a really, really interesting question, but a very hard one too. Defining disability. What is disability? How would you define the concept of disability? Who is a disabled person exactly? Hey, discuss with your telephone partner and pause it here. I'm guessing you noticed how hard this question was to answer. If you want to be a bit lazy and find a lazy person's answer, you might think of the laws in your own country. We do have legal definitions of disability. To be honest, I'm not especially interested in them. I'm not a lawyer, I'm a social worker, and this course has a kind of sociological theme. So I personally am not really interested in those legal definitions. They are, of course, valid to claim services in your country. If you want to claim services or benefits, those legal definitions are important. I don't think they say much about what a disability is. And I'm going to give you another approach to defining disability, which I think does say a lot about what disability is. And it's by this organization here. You can see the logo. I've taken the logo from Wikipedia. What organization is this the logo of? Yeah, you're guessing it's the World Health Organization, isn't it? The World Health Organization has been asking themselves this question, what is disability, for a long, long time. And I like the richness of their consideration. I mean, a long, long time, I really say this literally going back, I think, to the 1950s, the 1960s. They've been revising, improving definitions and terminology, and this is the current one here. Millennial definition, this. Disabilities is an umbrella term. So it's a kind of overheading, so to say, an umbrella term covering 3 other separate concepts. What separate concepts? The word we had here, we just had impairments, an umbrella term covering impairments and activity limitations and participation restrictions. Okay, so when I talk about disabilities, I've got 3 concepts in my head, and disabilities are some kind of combination of these 3 concepts. My next question for you, obviously, pause in a minute, natter with your partner. What do the individual words in bold in this definition mean? What on earth is an impairment? What on earth is an activity limitation? What on earth is a participation restriction? Goes without saying, be especially careful to try and differentiate the last 2, try and separate the last 2. Activity limitations, participation restrictions, sounds like the same thing. It's not. Those are 2 separate concepts. What do these words mean? Pause here. Unpause. Let's take the World Health Organization's own language to explain these points. An impairment is, they note, a problem in body function or structure. A problem in body function or structure. An activity limitation is a difficulty encountered by an individual in executing a task or an action. A difficulty in executing a task or an action. And a participation restriction is a problem experienced by an individual in involvement in life situations. So I'm hoping that's helping a little bit. Of course, I have another task for you. In pairs, try to apply this to the case of, say, a wheelchair user, giving concrete examples for that person, a person in a wheelchair. What is their impairment? What might an activity limitation be? And what about a participation restriction? Think about the example of that person and try and apply this World Health Organization terminology. Natter with your neighbor. Good. Maybe it's good if I answer the question. Let's be really, really explicit. The impairment would be the organic thing in that person's body. Maybe the wheelchair user doesn't have one leg, the right leg isn't there, and that would be the impairment, something that isn't there, something that in some way is damaged or missing. Good. The other 2 concepts, though, are more interesting. The activity limitation. There's some things which you can't easily do if you're using a wheelchair. The classic example would be steps. Okay, so the wheelchair user wants to enter a building, sees a set of steps, thinks, and that would be the activity limitation. That person can't get into the building using that door. They have to go around to find some other door. So activity limitation, a short, compact task or activity, something like climbing a set of steps. Good. So to contrast, what would the participation restriction be? I invite my wheelchair using friend to the pub. I'm meeting up with some mates in my local pub. But there's a step in front of the doorway and the door's a bit narrow and you can't get into their toilet if you're a wheelchair user. The toilet door's too narrow. So my wheelchair using friend is really, really annoyed and they would feel excluded from that situation. That would be an example of a participation restriction. The person cannot do some kind of social activity, some everyday life social activity, some everyday life communal activity, some kind of activity with other people. That would be the participation restriction. And my example of going to the pub, I could have given other examples, you know, playing certain sports, taking part in various events, things which are not maybe possible because of barriers for that person. Good. We're going to come to a close here. This is the end of my second video. Of course, we're going to continue with this topic and for me, more fascinating material. Maybe before we watch our next video, you can check out a couple more really interesting video clips. There's so much lovely material to make us think about disability on the internet. There's a wonderfully old clip from the 1940s about a blind farmer, well worth checking out. And I'm particularly fond of a UNICEF video on a deaf theatre school, which I can thoroughly recommend. So check those two videos out before watching my next clip. Hope you've enjoyed this one. Next one coming up shortly.